Welcome everybody to the Mandalorian Language Channel. Today we're going to be talking about some lost Mandalorian languages. Mando'a, as we know it today, was created by Jess Harlan and Karen Travis as part of the Republic Commando game and tie-in book series. It was the first attempt to really flesh out a solid Mandalorian language. However, while this may have been the first attempt at creating a large vocabulary for a Mandalorian language, it was not actually the first attempt at creating a Mandalorian language in general. There are actually three other sources which predate the Republic Commando Mando'a. These are Star Wars: Attack of the Clones, the video game Knights of the Old Republic, and the novel Cestus Deception. The Republic Commando Mando'a doesn't actually include these sources in its vocabulary, and there are sometimes official explanations that maybe these aren't Mando'a or they're some alternative dialect. But I'm not really satisfied with these explanations. Because if these sources came first, then they should be the ones that are providing the framework for any later additions to the Mandalorian language. So let's take a look at some of these examples. First, Star Wars: Attack of the Clones. In this movie, Obi-Wan goes to the planet Kamino and meets the bounty hunter Jango Fett. Jango Fett left his armor in plain view in the closet in his room, and he tells his son Boba to go close the door. And this is what he says. Now what's interesting is if you take this phrase and flip it around, the first two words become the last two words, and this is very clearly the door backwards in English. However, the first word is not backwards for close. Now, I don't think that in-universe this was intended to be backwards English. It just doesn't really make sense, and the fact that not all of the words are backwards English kind of points us away from this conclusion. Other explanations I've heard are that this is Huttese, and that explanation doesn't really fit either because Huttese seems to be a very common language throughout the Star Wars galaxy, and so Jango probably would have assumed that Obi-Wan could understand Huttese. So if we stick to just what is seen on screen, we have no reason to assume that what Jango is speaking to Boba is not Mandalorian. Now for the second source, the Knights of the Old Republic video game. In this game, there is a mission where you, the main player, finds a stowaway aboard your ship. Her name is Sasha Ot Sulem, and she speaks a bizarre mashup of her own language and Mandalorian. As part of the game, it's up to you, the player, to decode her language and figure out what she wants. Through the context and in the dialogue of the game, we learn that you, the player, can speak Mandalorian, and that Sasha's language contains a smattering of Mandalorian that's all mixed up. So while deciphering her language is part of the game, we can also decipher which parts of her language are Mandalorian based on the evidence in the game. I'm actually going to do a full in-depth analysis of this in a future video, but for now, I'll just give you a brief summary of how this process works. First, we know that there are some fairly obvious English words in what she says. Second, we can tell which words are Mandalorian because they'll be words that the player understands but don't need decoding, which means that any word that the player needs to decode is not Mandalorian because the player does speak Mandalorian. So, by removing all the words that can't be Mandalorian, whatever words we're left over with must be Mandalorian. Now for the third source, the Cestus Deception novel. I've actually purchased this novel, and while I haven't read through it in detail, I've skimmed a few bits. I did find the source that is listed on Wikipedia as being the Mandalorian that's in this book, which is Jango Tat, meaning Jango's brother. But we'll look at this in more depth in a later video. These three sources aren't nearly as exclusive as the work Karen Travis did, but they aren't insignificant either, and it's sad that these sources didn't get included in Karen Travis's Mandalorian. After all, they did come first. So as part of what I'm going to do with this channel is I'm going to rebuild Mando'a, incorporating all of these sources, starting with the first sources and using that as a framework upon which to build the later sources. I'll also be incorporating a better, more accurate translation of the Republic Commando songs by Jess Harlan, as well as improving the language building of Karen Travis's work. After all of that is in place, that will serve as the foundation upon which we can flesh out and complete the Mandalorian language. As I mentioned in my previous video, I know some people are going to be really upset that I would dare mess with Karen Travis's work, But there's no need to be upset, because you can always just consider the work that I'm doing here as an alternate version or a different dialect of mando'a. So if this project is something you're interested in following, then hit the subscribe button and click the bell notification. Make sure to like the video, and I'll see you in the next one.